Hi, I'm Clyde Poser of Rural Aviation Services, and today we're going to overhaul a bing64 carburetor. This carburetor came off a 912 ULS, and there was significant problems with it, idling and so forth, so we're going to do a complete overhaul today. As we look at the carburetor, we can see that it has had some different modifications done to it. This is a non-standard tube for the atmospheric vent, and if we look in the venturi, we can see that there is significant staining on the butterfly, and it's generally in a little bit dirtier condition than we like to see. Also, there has been some modification to the carburetor. This bolt held on a carburetor heater, and we will not be using that in the future. So we'll be taking that bolt out and discarding it. First thing we're going to do is remove the bail here that holds the carburetor bowl on. And as we remove that, we're going to take a look at the gasket. And we note that the gasket has some significant deformities into it. Obviously, the last person that put this gasket on was not aware of how to do it by putting it first in the slot that goes around the bottom of the carburetor and then installing the bowls with the floats. So we'll set that aside. Next, we'll remove the bail. And then we can get a look at the needle arms and the main jets. This would be the main jet. This would be the idle jet. This would be the idle mixture. This screw right here controls fuel as opposed to air, and as in the bing64 carburetor. The bing64, this is a fuel control. One of the things that we are going to do, even though we're going to replace the floats in the overhaul, is to check the float weight. These floats have been drying for several days, so we're going to put them on and see if they meet the spec. In this case, there's 6.81 grams, which actually does meet the spec of 7 grams maximum, but we will be replacing the floats in any event. The other thing we'll be looking at is inside the carburetor bowl to make sure there's no debris. There's also a jet down into this hole, and that jet is the jet that's used for the starting carburetor. In this case, the bowl looks fairly clean, so we're not going to worry too much about it. However, the bottom is kind of dirty, which we will be cleaning up. Next, we'll be taking the float needle and float arm apart. This is involved, there's a pin right here that we were going to knock out. So we would take a small punch, put it on the little pin, and knock that pull this little shaft out, set it down, and then we would pull the needle, float needle and float arms out. The needle has a small catch to it, and we were replacing the needle and the catch as well as the float arm. Okay, to remove the main jet, we'll use an 8mm wrench. And we want to make sure that we keep the washer with the main jet. Next, we'll remove the needle jet. The needle jet comes out. And there is the needle jet. You'll note that it is very dirty and in need of overhaul. Now, what I would suggest when you're working on your carburetor is to get a set of hollow ground screwdrivers. The hollow ground screwdrivers provide a much tighter fit in all of the jets and screws so that they are not damaged or boogered when you're overhauling your carburetor. Next, we'll remove the idle jet. The idle jet has an O-ring that will be replaced, and we will be looking through the idle jet to make sure that it's clear. If the idle jet is not clear and you need to clean it out, the best thing to do is to use a single strand from a wire brush. A single strand from a wire brush is very thin, and it is able to fit in the hole in the needle jet and clean it out. We'll remove the fuel intake, and note that it has 3 copper gaskets that will be replaced when we put the new banjo fuel fitting on. There are 2 springs, and we'll note that the carburetor was set up for spring-loaded to the off position. Normal carburetor setup is in this particular slot and this particular hole for spring-loaded to full throttle, just in case your throttle cable breaks. Some manufacturers prefer the spring-loaded to the off position. This screw here is the idle stop, which will be adjusted after the carburetor is reinstalled on the aircraft during balancing. This spring is the spring that holds the starting carburetor arm closed. This is the starting carburetor right here. And when the starting carburetor is full on, fuel will be sucked out of the bowl with this tube, and there is a hole on the inside here if you look, and that's where the air goes across the starting carburetor to act as a miniature carburetor, and that is the venturi for sucking the fuel up when you start the engine. It's important to have the throttle at idle when using the starting carburetor. Otherwise, if the throttle is partially opened, there won't be enough air going through the venturi intake in the inside of the carburetor. Next, let's take off the top of the dome. Continuing on with removing the dome, we'll remove this other screw here. And remove the dome. The dome has a diaphragm on it. This will be replaced. One thing to note, the small nubbin on the side of the dome will fit in the little indentation in the carburetor body. And we'll point that out when we reassemble the carburetor. Be very careful of the spring. The spring has been calibrated for this particular carburetor, and we'll note lots of dirt and debris on the portion where the carburetor slides. This will all be cleaned. To remove the needle from the carburetor slide, it is necessary to remove a screw that's down this tube in the carburetor. It's a soft aluminum screw, so it's very important to not strip it out. I have made a special, I have taken a I think it's a 3/8 bolt and ground a special blade in the bottom of it so that it'll fit down into the screw very tightly so that I may remove it. So this is the screw that holds the needle in place. It also has a small O-ring. This O-ring is what prevents the needle from rotating and preventing the small circlip from cutting the needle and allowing it to drop in the carburetor. This was a later modification to prevent the needle from moving. Also of note, the little aluminum screw that holds the needle in place will have a little drop of Loctite 243 applied to it to prevent it from loosening. Next, we'll remove the starting carburetor. One thing to note, there is a small dot on the axle that goes into the starting carburetor. It's very important that the main arm of the starting carburetor control points to that dot. If this dot is reversed, pointing to the small end of the arm, the starting carburetor will not operate properly. So upon reassembly, we want to make sure that that dot points to the large portion of the arm. Remove the 4 screws that hold the starting carburetor on. Also of note, slight bit of Loctite 243 on these screws also. There is a gasket, starting carburetor. This gasket will be replaced and is part of the kit for an overhaul. So we're also going to remove the mixture screw. It also has an O-ring. It'll be replaced. And we're pretty much down to just nothing but the carburetor body at this point. The butterfly is pretty dirty. We'll be removing the butterfly also. There are two copper screws in there. Here again, it's important to use the proper screwdriver. A hollow ground screwdriver that fits the slot in the screws very carefully. The screws for the carburetor butterfly valve do come in the kit, so these will be replaced with new. It's very important to note that which way the carburetor Butterfly valve goes in. Okay, next we'll remove the throttle arm. And this will give us an opportunity to remove the bracket that holds the butterfly axle in the carburetor body. The reason we want to remove the axle is because there is a O-ring that needs to be replaced. And you'll note how dirty and the axle is. So that just about completes the disassemble of the carburetor. We'll remove this tube here and get rid of it. Because we will be replacing the carburetor atmospheric vent. Now, some people think that this might be a drain, but this is actually the atmospheric vent for the carburetor bowl for the carburetor to operate properly. Occasionally, customers will call me and say, hey, my carburetor is leaking out of the overflow tube. And what I tell them is that probably the engine is vibrating such that the floats are unseated. The floats are vibrating around and they're unseating the float needle, allowing excess fuel to come in. If excess fuel comes in, the atmospheric vents are right here, these two little holes, and fuel will overflow and come out of the atmospheric vent. It's not an overflow. Okay, that completes the disassembly of the carburetor. We'll clean this up and then we'll go to the reassembly.